Ah, the drink the true there, the name Jasimuju Tommy Gizibi, Jasilane the rest.
So the Dharma teaching we'll be studying today is a Ngolchu Togme Sangpo's practice of 37 practices of the Bodhisattvas.
The name cousin be Chutunchik, the name Kansagore, the Mutini, Tikto Mason, Karizan Natos Nasons, the Lani Gonda Shubin is.
Last week, we were unavailable to meet for class because Tulku was ill, so he would like to apologize for that.
During the Maranzo Jasalali, the Latini, Tomar Geva, Legitun, Art Geva, Shungitun, Tamar Geva, Jugitun, Sunginani, Deni, Tomar Geva, Legitun, Tarsavare, Tatana Kaps Babadi, Deni, Pardu Geva, Shungitun, the La took the rest in Maranzo.
So if we classify this text into the goodness at the beginning, middle, and end, we have already completed the preparatory practices, which comprise the goodness at the beginning and have arrived at the main topic of the treatise, which is the goodness in the middle.
Deni, Shungi, Dwendilada, to the Kibusum Lamla Juxus, Kini Kibu Rab Kibu Kansore Rabding Tasums and Kibusum Gilam Girimbas, Ni Dungueres, Kulongi, Semgi Tausiana, Semgi, Kunzurgi, Semgi, Dundam Gisengesha, Nisha, Tini Nigid Nani, Tini Kunzurgi, Dundam Dilla, Tini Kibusums in Jana. But the nature looks shumedila.
Dondamgi Jangstamgi Gune Kibush Wong Sungi Saki Yoruba.
All Semgi la Kunzup, Semgi Chigna, Dundam Gisemgi Nisha, and Tana Caps Baba the Kunzup Gisemgi Dilla, Kini Kibusum Gilam Girimbas.
The main part of the treatise is comprised of the paths or the three different beings, the paths of beings of the three different kinds of faculties, and is primarily concerned with the presentation of the way that they respectively develop bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is presented in terms of the relative and ultimate bodhicitta, and the relative bodhicitta itself is further subdivided into two categories. Koto Gimendula.
The Kunzup Gidanga, Kunzup Semgi Dilla, the name Sums, Kisumimba.
Sorry, there are actually three subdivisions within the generation of conventional bodhicitta.
Okay.
Again?
Yeah.
Hello? What's that?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Oh, Lazo. Then the Moshi Dilla Nish Rala. kunzup gi semge da dondam gi semge sha tene kunzup gi semge de la tene kebusum gi lam gi rimba tensus.
So really the main part of the text is divided into the two parts of generating a relative and ultimate bodhicitta. And then the generation of relative bodhicitta is subdivided into the presentations according to the three different kinds of beings and their respective capacities.
Tene ta tanda first thambo de tene kebu chumu gi lam gi rimba tensus.
So first, now we will present the generation of bodhicitta according to the being of smaller faculties.
Tadi kebusum gi lam gi rimba tensus di kebusum seduzani chiga di yang kogo res ngarazu kebusum se di kansa gi lo kulung madawasum ki rimba jiyures di shagur mado yang chue kurang la ya dinde kyasilali kurang la dinde kibusum gi lam sene dinde tambo niba sumba se ji rimba ji dinde yo mares di rana susu gi kansa gi lo gi rimba nanzo ni capacity se dola understanding capacity go rimba ji dinde madawasum residus.
So these three different kinds of beings, what does that mean? This refers to the different kinds of motivation that are present in the minds of beings. It's not the case that our text is presenting three graduated paths, like first there's the path of smaller beings, then of middling beings, then of greater beings. What this actually refers to is what a faculty or what a kind of being refers to is the scope of motivation within that being's mind.
Ne tanda tambo di kebu chungu gi lam gi rimba se kebu chungu se do yang arazu chik di chungu se do chungjung se kebu mi chungjung la na si ta samlo tangzu di kebu chungu gi lam re te ta kebu chungu se de zane samlo tangzu re kulong de chungjung re te ina ye kyen da yunde ni gi na ne de yunde re ka samlo dangdang de chungjung re te ina kyen da yunde ni gi na ne yunde re di indu parazu de la chang gores ngaraz de la lobjung chi gores ngaraz de la ya lam la lab gores.
So first we'll be talking about the path of smaller beings or beings of smaller capacity. It's not the case we're speaking literally about people who are small in size. It has to do with the scope of their attitude, the size of their motivation, so to speak. That's what's small in this case. But if we were to speak of this path in terms of whether there's something wrong with it or whether it's good or bad, it's definitely a good thing, this path of smaller beings. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing, but the scope of the attitude is smaller.
Tini dedang tani kebu ding di lam dia chipare kebu ding se du jani ta ko samlo dang na re kolong de re kinang de ding re de inda kyen da yende ni gi na ni yende re di indu marazu de la lam la la kores de la nyamlen che kores.
So the same holds for beings of middling capacity. This term middling refers to their frame of mind and the scope of their motivation. And if we were to ask if it's a good or a bad thing, it's definitely a good thing, something to be praised for its quality, something that we ourselves must practice as well.
Tani da kebu chungu gi lam de la kebu chungu Sena Kandajula Sergei Sena.
Oh, yang your song. Okay.
Keep a chungi lam servade Kandajula Sergei Nas Chivastana.
So, how do we define the path of smaller beings?
The keep a chungi lam servade tene. Ko samlo tangdang kulong di korang ge samlo di ji korwale pa tardo dang korwale pa tardo gilo mayin baji jige ngezong sun le pa taregi dang deni ngando lamigi lada migi dewa tobegi debaji yora o digi sambulo tangdang dila teni kibu chungi lams kibu chungi gi samlo tangso res kulong.
So, what is the outlook of a smaller being? A smaller being doesn't develop the desire to become liberated from samsara in its entirety. Rather, a being of smaller capacity is one who wishes to be free from the lower realms, but who still very much desires to acquire the riches and splendor of the higher realms, the realms of gods and humans. So this kind of outlook, this kind of motivation is what we refer to as a smaller capacity. This is what...
Di korwala le pa dole korwale pa thare ene korwale pa bet korang tharpa thobe gi lam reves na ti lam mares.
And so if you wonder if this path of smaller beings could lead one to become completely free from samsara, could lead to total liberation, it is not, in fact, a path that leads to complete and total liberation.
Nekap dungal meba suedang nekap deva talha lada mi deva thobe gi thap jires thap gi lam jires nekap di indu ke bichungi gi lam se di tene jile se geres.
So really what the path of smaller beings is that it consists of methods for attaining the temporary happiness of being born in the gods and human realms and getting and temporarily freeing oneself from the pain and misery of the lower realms. The set of methods for attaining this particular goal is what we refer to as the path of smaller beings.
So the ko kibu chungi se di nekap gi jige kanso kore dewa thobde samda dungal le pa demu dungal de meba suegi thap tawzi latini ko kibu chungi se do nekap gi dungal da jige neso sum gi dungal le pa jigne tini ya naranzo mondo lada mi gi dewa latini 지 마네소 숨기 동안에 빼 잡고 지고 여도 사다 미기 대화되다 코딜라 뛰어나 사다 미기 대화 치보다 통고를 내서 숨기 동안나 사다 미기 대화될 때는 그 대화 내가 대화되라 코드니 대화 인체는 디기 토백이 되니 지게 라 토백이 탑라더니 그 전용도 되니 그 기부 중요 차도 그래서 삼로 당수 충용지가.
So the emphasis here is on the word temporary. The path of smaller beings is concerned with the temporary, acquiring temporary happiness and avoiding temporary suffering. So the outlook of a being of smaller capacity is that they are very afraid of the harsh and vicious miseries that are present in the lower realms, the 3 lower realms of hell, the hungry ghosts and animals. And being frightened by this incredible suffering, they wish instead to attain the temporary, what is in fact temporary happiness in the realms of gods and humans. And so comparatively, this outlook, this frame of mind is smaller than the others to come.
Tadi neso sumdi teni Quran da shindu sukawa sena pe mese dunga le du sani dunga neso sumge dunga dilla ko dunga la excuse yo mare dunga dilla teni break yo mare continue ko dunga nyang de res 24 hours ko dunga sha yo de du teni dille dewa Quran tiga je yo mare kola da mi ki dewa yore tos yore kola break yore kola excuse yore tos dewa yore se de na su so la freedom ji yore ta ina ne so sum la ta freedom mer ko nge su yo ma se nge su break do de de me do zani su ka sto ko pe me se ke su mi to ba ngara zo na nam she changmo tanda New York de kawa jap so na kawa pe changmo yoral ice keran duglo ma ko wa chilo de ne de to mara sukawa pe message changmo freezing dendre gi ngeso sum gi dunga de pe message sukawa yedu teni koda milhada mi gi dewati nega gi dewati thobe ji yore thene teni dilla chengdu tanda ngeso sum le ya thardu ki lo dilla teni ke bu chumu se gi res.
So we must understand that the pain and suffering in the lower realms is extremely difficult to bear. It's excruciating. The beings in the lower realms, they have no break, no leave from their suffering, no excuse away from their suffering. There's not even a mustard seed's worth of happiness to be found there, and they suffer 24/7 continuously. Here in the human realms, we can see, can't we, that we do enjoy some happiness. No, we do experience breaks from utter misery. It's not 24/7 excruciating pain. And to imagine the lower realms, we can imagine what it's like when the weather is very, very cold, when it's icy and snowing. If we were to go outside with no clothes on, we wouldn't be able to stay out there. We just couldn't do it. It would be unbearable. And this is how the suffering in the lower realms is described. And so when one, fearing this kind of excruciating suffering, applies the methods to be free from that suffering and to attain the relative happiness of the higher realms, this is what we call the path of smaller beings.
Sikji doala shindu söke ngezong dungal nam digbe legi tebur tube sum dechir sokla babjan digbe le namya meji gyase laglen yin sum doa shindu söke ngezong dungal nam se shindu söke se ngezong gi dungal de shindu söka baresta ngezong gi dungal de sadam nyalwala sadam gi dungal ida la tekum gi dungal tondola kolju ki dungal tadi dushana de dungal sum ngeso sum sedo da nyawa re ida re todu re tisum la ngeso sum segre tini nyawa la ni chadang ki dungal ra chane chachawe dungal thang dungal tadi le mangbuji sum re kusana me shalong da peja mangbu na tini ida la tegum ki dungal tini chogoto kala ta sago chena kala manye te ani kum khakko myongdo tini chuthunge mewi tene dunga ani tondrola da kolju gi dunga ta yamdo san tondro yagbo erda ina yang kola freedom yo mare tamboshina kashi migi wangdo degore kashi ni tondro chiki chikla san tondro mangbo nya dang de jamso nangde mangbo sagido chenpo gi chungjong la sa chungjong mangbo gi chenpo la sa tene ki dunga mangboji meso sumla dunga yores de dungal nam se da meso dunga nam
All right, so the verse in our text that corresponds with the path of smaller beings is number 8, which reads, "The practice of all the bodhisattvas is never to commit a harmful act, even though not to do so might put one's very life at risk. For the sage himself has taught how negative actions will ripen into the manifold miseries of the lower realms, so difficult to endure." And again, here we see that the suffering in the lower realms is described as difficult to endure, unbearable would be another way to translate it. And so to cover this briefly, we can first identify the 3 lower realms refer to the hell realm, the hungry ghost realm, and the animal realms. And in the hell realms, beings suffer very, very intensely from heat and cold. They burn and they freeze continuously. And in the hungry ghost realm, they suffer from hunger and thirst. They may be extremely hungry from not having eaten, but there's nothing around to eat. There's extremely thirsty, but there's nothing around for them to drink, and so they suffer from hunger and thirst. And in the animal realm, they suffer from servitude or slavery. And the way we can understand this, we can observe the animal realm, is that they don't really have much freedom. Many animals are forced into the servitude of humans, put to work by humans, or even slaughtered by humans. And even the ones who are not live in constant fear of being hunted and eaten by one another. The big animals eat the small animals and so forth. And so these are the sufferings of the lower realms, which are described as difficult to endure.
Di ta dungal di tanda nesosum gi dungal di debure. Gyudan debu shana debure. Tadi dungal di gi gyu khan la teni chungure sena teni mawal dikpi legi debu tube songs. Teni di dungal di gi gyu di kare resena teni nyomong bata leni res nyomong da leni. Teni legi le karna le gewa lateni debu deva chunga ta le mige wa lateni debu dunga chunga teni le mige wa ge le de lateni tani nezusum tadi le mige wa nyomomba de khare resena de le mige wa chunga gyu dawodi nyomomba de teni toksum de decha shedang tibuksum di nyomomba de lateni teni mige wa de lateni teni debu dunga chungi nezusum la todo nezusum la te dunga yobura o dires de dikpi legi debu tobe sons de taba charge toba ge teni chumden de sombres.
So these miseries of the 3 lower realms are fruits that we reap from our karma. If we think in terms of cause and effect, this kind of suffering is the effect of actions that we ourselves commit. And as we read in the verse, it says, "The sage himself has taught how negative actions will ripen." The Buddha Shakyamuni, the Bhagavan perfect Buddha, gave an extensive presentation as to what kinds of actions are good or evil, which ones are virtuous and will result in happiness, the experience of happiness, and which are unvirtuous and will result in an experience of suffering. And what determines whether any given action is virtuous or unvirtuous is whether they're based on the 3 poisons within our mind. If we're motivated by a great desire, hatred, or ignorance, any action that we undertake influenced by these 3 poisons is an unvirtuous action, which will then become the cause that ripens into the result of suffering such as we experience in the three lower realms. So that's what determines. So if there's no cause, then no result will arise, right? So if there are no unvirtuous actions to produce the suffering of the lower realms, then there will be no suffering of the lower realms.
Indu di rinjin tenwa se dola, rinjin tenwa nangla tini chadang shedang timuk dang degi leni mige was, chadang shedang timuk sumdi degi leni mige wares, doja shedang timuk sumdi degi leni mige wa, mige leni dungal kuns, mige wegi leni tini dungal tamje dungal da, tondrugi dungal, nyawagi dungal, yidagi dungal kun, Deji ngendro tamje dos, di ngendro tanda neso sumgi ngendro jeyora, digi debu dita ngendro di rese, dikbaje, nyo mongba ni dikbe le chire, dikbe le ni dunga chungure, dunga le dini korwa, neso sum chatu go res.
Ni rinjin tengwa digi zepapo surya?
Rinjin tenwa zepapo da ni kira koso masa rinjin tenwa le se.
So in the jewel garland, we find a verse that reads, all deeds afflicted by hatred, desire, and delusion, these are deeds considered unvirtuous. That's a on the fly translation. Sorry if that was clunky, but and then it goes on to say that from unvirtuous actions, all misery arises. So there's no pain that we can experience that arises from anything other than negative karma, our own negative deeds, the pain of the animal realm and the pain of the hungry ghost realm, the misery of the hell realm. These all arise as the result of our own non-virtuous actions, our own bad karma, and are what determines whether our actions are good or bad, and whether our karma is good or bad is the motivation behind it, whether we are under the spell, so to speak, of these three primary afflictive emotions.
Tini ngarazu migewa chu says doa, migewa chu da gewa chu says. Migewa chu nangla chama du duber, tini ngagi koni migewa che, ani yigi koni migewa che, ani lugi koni migewa chu. Di tamji migewa de chu la tini digi debu di Teni dunga chungures. Dunga di le sana le da kanso gore migewa chadu gore. Ta kang to to ji neso sum la madroya ke thapshe zo di teni di ngarazo lu nga yisum gi migewa di pang gores. Ani migewa di pang na teni gewa chu dub gores. Gewa chu dube di khani chu dub gores ne yan rinjen chama na la sum shadu. Rinjen chama daga ra macha tanji dochak se do tanda macha madang timuk mes. Macha madang timuk me degi leni gewa yin se. Dezu sum di macha bache madang bache timuk me ba ina degi leni gewa yin se. Gele dentro thamje tang se. Gele gewa digi jebu de kharere dedo. Ngajo tanji du dungal ki doa sha so tanda di dewa ki doa. Dewa. Ta negab ji dewa ine de ta khaso thardu ki dewa ina de. Kini gele dentro thamje ta kewa kunde dewa thops. Khadu ina deni dewa thop gre sere. Khazi doja meba lugi goni migeba meba. Ngagi goni migeba meba. Yigi goni migeba meba ina. Doja shina de muksu meba ina. Deni Digi Nanazula dendro top gires, dendro senata kibugi kaso gore. Drowaji top gre de kibu de drowaji top sona khadu wina nazu kibu yung gres dewa te sakji ki dewa inare sami ki dewa inare.
And so, generally speaking, we can categorize non-virtuous actions into the 10 non-virtues, the non-virtues that we perform with our body, speech, and mind. And so then the path of smaller beings means to, as much as if we don't want to suffer in the lower realms, as we've described, then as much as we can, we need to abandon the non-virtues of body, speech, and mind, and instead practice their opposites, which are the 10 virtues. And the jewel garland continues to identify what virtue means. It says that without attachment, without anger, and without ignorance, such actions constitute virtue, and wherever all happiness, all happy beings are the result of virtue. And so it's clearly defined as the exact opposite of non-virtue, as that if the things we do with our body, speech, and mind that are unsullied by attachment or desire, unsullied by our anger, unsullied by our ignorance or stupidity, such actions are considered virtuous, and these are the causes of all happiness, either within samsara, defiled happiness, or the undefiled happiness of nirvana.
Tene drum temba se doa drum temba ki ateni karsundu sena tata kewi lela mabe na tata kewi ki lela mabe na chimar dungal nyong war gyutta rese tanda da kewi ki lela mabe na da dunga mige vesha da chidro na teni chimar da ngazong maomba da rang chechima teni dungal nyong war gyutta res dunga mabu nyong gres tindu tanda nira kewi ki lela bego res ngaransu sangma.
So then there's a quote by Dromtonpa, one of Atisha's principal students, that says, if now we do not persevere in virtuous actions, then later we will only come to suffering. And this is pretty straightforward now. Dromtonpa means that if we fail to use this present time that we have to exert ourselves in virtuous actions, then if we don't do that, the only scenario we can arrive at is suffering in the future. And so this is what we have to do. We have to persevere in virtue.
Chigidi to mezosungi dungalgi gyude tini lunga yisumla pa jariona dudu rajishena yigi gone tini samba ngemba chiba tini samba ngemba ta ngemba suduzane bila napsim nesim ten lokda la sobata di migi wechu namla yore tindi ki samba ngemba Chibadang, teni ngagi goni teni tenchang dusu ngarang soji kecha sik ngemba, sik duja bila phoge re teni migi mi phajo la semba la phoge re teni jiga ngachal re sik pe dubu teni changpo shena semba le samyongdu kasi ngarang so kani masheba ina semba ne samdena the rang la ne ma de shembal ne gu mare ta ngai ke samlo dukja ji samlo tang de na ko semba de la ko action ji ma chi na lagle matar na semba de ngem ba de rang la ne gu ma de shen le gu mare 다 셈바 냠바당 냠도 되니 식 독부지 칸이 쇼르소나 다디 잡고야 되니 파조들라 암주로 고르구라 고용도 때 파조미들라 폭도 그래 폭도나 디고 셈바 껴도 그래 야나 셈바 독도 그래 되니 거기 락래 따르는 거야 고용도 오고말 독자지 라우스 셈이더니 코파 랭갸도 되니 초파슈레 고데니 두고래 misunderstanding 세고래다 정보시나 등상의 C politician 라이드네 도와 계정에 받기게 미망보지 돌아 땅보고도 된도 나네 되니 이제 독자 주부당들 라베야 돼 되니 야보 말에 되니 류기고네 되니 다 가서고래 남주 만다와 속제발라 속바 되니 류기고네 다 되지 나라도 등상에 속제발라 마진발렘발라 속바 ni misang chue ba la su ba de gi choba ngimba chi so nang le de ndo choba ngimba de chi on na de ni milaya shen la ya ne du ra ra yin ki bu me chi shen la ki bu me ba cha de o di ta de sum de du shan na lu ma yusum gi me ge wa de la de ni chi ge ne su sum de dwe
So to speak in more detail about these 10 non-virtues of body, speech, and mind, there are the 3 non-virtues of mind, which are envy or covetousness, ill will or malice, and wrong view. These effectively boil down to bad thoughts, negative thoughts that we have, misguided thoughts, if you will. And then in terms of speech, the 4 non-virtues of speech refer to lying, abusive speech, divisive speech, and idle chatter. And there's really a whole lot of that these days, isn't there? Honestly speaking, if we are just thinking bad thoughts, but we don't do anything about it, we don't speak our mind or do something with our bodies, then we may still bring harm to ourselves via the actions of the cause and effect of karma, but we won't harm others. But through the non-virtues of speech and body, this negative thinking, this wrong thinking, not only harms ourselves, but radiates outward and harms others. You can see that this is very prevalent these days, especially among political groups. One person will lie or speak abusively, and then the target group of that will respond in kind with more abuse and more lies and more slander, and many misunderstandings and conflicts arise from this. And so that's important to keep in mind. And then the 3 non-virtues of body refer to killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. So this is bodily behavior, which is negative or bad. And so these 10 together, generally speaking, can be said to comprise the causes that result in the suffering of the lower realms.
Tene sikje sumba di dejir sokla ba jan digbele namya miji jase lali yin che sumdwa ta pe jawoji shana ta ngala da mi goban thogi ngeso sumdila ta tunga syoka wachi du ta ti ngeso sumda ma kyune koram jogu me ta nga pe shegi du ta ngala da mi dewa di negab gi dewa inaya di thop godu sene ta rangla di ta di ngeso sumda doe gi gyu khari re du teni leda nyomo ba ni du ta leda nyomo ba ni de nga miso ta nga gyuni chigi me ta ngala da mi goban inji mi ji thop gi in sambo ji lepsana teni ta mi ji le ondu o ta kyo ta dikpa chi sho dikpa ma chi na nga chirang segi menda ji sha de la ende chi kyo ta drink dikpa nezo sum la dwe ge mi ge le ji chi sho ma na nga chirang segi menda de sha na That's all about na the beaches, na cars and as the middle stuff. I me go on Jajika Toby is not the Medashia Kunalesena Sena. That will be the beaches and the desert soul about the beaches. The Horace the soul about young Digbile, Name Miji Jazil the Kaduana Chigi mess, Karamalesena says. Then Miches Edi, Dini de la Dito the Kelly, Damja, Kelly, Damja Chini. That did it, then it will say John Joseph Banam Gilale res, Konabageta, Kibu Kasogore, Kibu Chungu Gilamki. And the Karas Akunda, you're doing in on you do, then it John Joseph by Anthony, you did in Bichani, they are Konabagilale and Yamsli give rest.
And so we read in the verse that the practice of the Bodhisattvas is never to commit a harmful act, as we've been referring to, even though not to do so might put one's very life at risk. So it's sort of like this. If we understand the suffering of the lower realms, we observe the suffering of the lower realms and think, I'm not going there. I ain't going. No way. I've got to stay in the God and human realms where there's happiness to be enjoyed. There's no way I'm going to the lower realms. And so we have to further consider, well, what's the cause of being born in the lower realms? It's afflicted emotions and the negative karma that we create. And so if there's just no way I want to go to the lower realms, then I'm just never going to engage with the afflicted emotions and specifically non-virtuous actions, like never, not even once. And it says that we refrain from non-virtue, even though not to do so may put one's very life at risk. So the image that's being evoked is that even if someone puts a gun to our head and says, do this non-virtuous thing, like kill this person or whichever, tries to force us on threat of our life to do something non-virtuous, we don't want to go to the lower realms, so we don't do it. It doesn't matter. It's like you have a gun to my head. If you're going to kill me over it, kill me. And this is a commitment that we make, or a promise that we will continuously observe to refrain from these kinds of harmful actions that result in the pain of the lower realms. And these are included among the practices. This is the path of the smaller vehicle, or of the smaller being, remember, but it's included in the practices of the Bodhisattvas because, like, as we observed, if we ask, is this a good thing or a bad thing? It's obviously a good thing, a thing with qualities. So it is included in the practice of the Bodhisattvas.
Mevare ta dewa mesedi karisegirusana pena korwa kap gitzelan dewa namye yoma yinsi sumira korwa di kap gitze doa mel kap gitze la ngadu dena dewa yomara sugura di induzani korwa sede di naji kap gitze naji res dewa kadu yoma res tadi dewa mesedi karisegirusana gyuro mebi dewa di yoma res Giro yobe sakje dewadi nyunyu yore lada mila yore. Tangazo sum lada yomare lada mila yore tos. Ina yandi gurbi dewa sigir. Giro maybe dewadi yomare sigir. Di induzani jawa jambe ki jawa jamba yowa konge sumire. Mizang wala tishim mes mizang wala mazo chapsang la tishimbu yomare timashimbu. Tanda desum da korwa na dewa mes jawa jambe Mizang wala dishim me korwa na dewa mes. Kasane gyurwa maybe dewa di yo maresere. Gyurwa maybe dewa. Unconditioned dewa.
So that covers the path of smaller beings. And so then what comes next is the path of middling beings. And so remember, this refers to their attitude or the scope of their motivation. And so middling beings want to be free from samsara in its entirety, not just the lower realms. They observe that there's no happiness in samsara, even in the higher realms. No unchanging happiness anyway, no unconditioned happiness anyway. The changing, transient happiness of samsara is like trying to balance something on the tip of a needle. If you know, nothing's going to stay on the tip of a needle, it's going to go right through it. And so all the happiness that we might experience in samsara is like that. It's transitory happiness that's inevitably going to change on us, going to turn on us, going to betray us, if you will. And it's like the protector Maitreya said, there's a verse that was spoken by the protector Maitreya, which reads, "Shit never smells good, samsara never goes well." And so we have to understand it like this. It's like we go into a public bathroom, like an Indian bathroom. There's nothing good to be smelled in there, is there? It's all bad. And similarly, there's nothing good to be had in samsara. It's just suffering.
Tadi kibu shungugi lamgi rimbadi shuchabayis ta kibu dingi lamgi rimbas lamgi densu de kibu ding se de ta tangi di kibu chungu se de mesusum le thardo gi logic la teni bhadami gi dewa thobe mega gi dewa thobe gi chidu teni chöchigi res ra tikba pange wa duchigi res. That tanda kapsuba kibu ding di ladam gi dewa deyang teni sarje gi dewa indu negab gi dewa cham madu gyurwa mebi dewa de mare du samni ta rani chikbu tharwa thu godu sene ran chikbu ta khorwa dilla tani ngai shu ba dewa yo mares khap gi zele dewa name mindu sen jawa jamba gi bizam wala dishin mes khorwa la dewa mes idu san ta ladam gi dewa deyang teni negab gi dewa indu gyurbi dewa indu ta gyurwa mebi dewa mare du samni tani mayanda tharwa thu godu Hamji Kimba Sigi Yomar, Tarba Top Gudus, that the Korwa de la Mone Devachi Emidu, Karisana Lada Migi Deva, Kazi Lada Migi Deva, the Mazutanda Top Dera, Mazumi Rede. Naina Nila and Keka Nashiki Dumal, Gurvi Dumal, the name Taduma Mambojere. Mila and nothing Sangama and the tomatoes you and Santuma Mai. Karisana develop Mambucha, then the Degasking around Bigi. Samlo tangsu re tini dunga mangbo jirbila tini hlaya tini dunga mangbo jire de dunga thanje tanda sa che gi silwa nangsin negab gi dewa ning jibo ji thong ma do tanda yu jam ji degir ma do chesu tini mewa cha du ger ken ji theona tini dunga de sama sarje gi dewa indo ko ju du ger res ju wi chu ji indo dewa di tapatembo jiyo mares.
So again, to clarify the difference between the paths of smaller beings and middling beings, for the smaller beings, they practice the Dharma out of a desire to escape the lower realms. They practice refraining or abandoning the 10 non-virtues because they don't want to go to the lower realms. But middling beings, in accordance with this quote we just read from Protector Maitreya, just as shit never smells good, samsara never goes well, they observe that even in the human realms and the God realms, all the so-called happiness is transitory. It's not true happiness. It's not unchanging happiness. It's not reliable. And as such, the middling being thinks like, I myself, by myself, am going to break free from samsara as a whole. Now, in terms of the middling being, we're not yet thinking about rescuing others from samsara, and we're not talking about omniscience, the omniscience of Buddhahood, but we're thinking, I myself am going to be liberated from the whole of samsara, including the suffering of the gods and humans realms. And we can easily observe the suffering of the human realms. Just look around. There's much suffering to be had in the human realms. And even in the god realms, they experience some semblance of sublime beauty just for a brief moment, and then that too is gone. That too is the suffering of change ultimately. And so the middling being seeks to be free from samsara in its entirety.
Sisum dewa tsa tse silva shin yu zam shi gi jik bi chujin yin nam ya mi gyur tar bi gopang chok dun dun yer ba gyase lalin yin se kibu dingi sik.
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself. Verse 9 is the verse in our text which corresponds to the path of middling beings, which reads, the practice of all the bodhisattvas is to strive towards the goal, which is the supreme state of changeless, everlasting liberation, since all the happiness of the three realms lasts but a moment, and then is quickly gone, just like dewdrops on blades of grass.
Dadi tingi gong du shuba nasi sisum sibasum sidu zani da kashi sai ting na yoba da namgi ting na yoba da yana sukam sumi ki kam sum sidu al deyan sigi yore da denzo la dang mi ki dewa di tani ngai gong du shuba nasi za zegi shoge ngabo ngarazu za kangla silba yungi doa silba diu sigi doa di za silba di ani de zamji to zamji nima sha sona ko zai silba di lamsa kam dugres di indu ngaranzo kamsum ki sada mi ki dewa de yang deni tani ngai gong du shuba nasi gyurwe ki dunga indu negab zamato ko gyurwa mebi pet korang permanent dende yo mares korang jigbi chuji indu teni di gangsa tanda kibuting di gangsa se di teni lada mi ki tobe dewa diya negab indu ta ko tarbaji topgudu samba diya tarba diya nani simje tamji jik tarba tobe ki chedo mayimba rani jikbu korwa kamsong korwa le teni jigni tang ta nga jik tarbaji top gosare teni tarba top goar jebala kanji gore diba pang gore gewa duk gores teni diba pange ta diba pang sedu tangi chikpare migewa chu pange da teni gewa chu drup sedu ge ta di khaso gore tocha me shedang me timu me lega khare china thap temba tila teni ji gewa drup sigir diba pang sedi teni migewa gi nunga yisum ji gone teni 지가 루기 거는 미게와 나기 거는 미게와 이기 거는 미게와 가리 지게와 된솔라 되니 마치와 빵 이게와 쭉 띠빠뽕 되니 데데 제워제바 라니 집부 타바 토바이기 된 두니야야지 네 지니 가스나 내가기 대와 단지 시숨기 대와네 실바나시 레두스 되니 유즘식도 유통도 뭐지 되기를 마도 그 타마 그 직비 추제레스 jigsido meba pa zabdo meba chaya ge chujin indu teni ta nga di digi mindu negab gi da majurue gi dewaji top gosare majurue jurwa mebi gi dewaji top gosare tim jurwa megi devadi namia majur tharbi gobang chos khadu yan jurwa meba gi devadi tharbare te gobang se bor topsa gi chokdo jurbadi tini tharbares ta di top gosare tini di top goro gobar jebala digi döndu nyer ko ta digi döndu 타바 토베게 된도 인게를 거랬어. 다 만게를 쓰도 자니 다 가와체 거랬어. 아니 네 된도 인게로 자슬라니 인스. 이 도르도 슈샤기.
All right. So, as we've said before, the happiness that we experience in the gods and human realms is not changeless happiness. It's totally impermanent. It's temporary. Here, we read, since all the happiness of the three realms lasts but a moment and then is quickly gone, just like dewdrops on blades of grass. So the three realms here refers to the three realms of samsara, the desire realm where we are, and then the form and formless realms, which delineate different kinds of god realms. And all the happiness of these three realms is here likened to dewdrops on blades of grass. So just like a little water droplet on a blade of grass dries up and disappears the very moment the sun shines on it, the happiness of the higher realms anywhere in samsara is ultimately going to change into suffering. There's no permanence to it whatsoever. And so the middling being observes this fact, observes that the happiness of even the higher realms is impermanent and ultimately unsatisfying, and thinks, I need to achieve this state, a state of happiness which is changeless, a state of happiness which will never betray me, like it reads in our text. The supreme state of changeless, everlasting liberation. And the method of doing this for the middling being is more or less the same as for the smaller being. It's abandoning non-virtue, abandoning any kind of non-virtue of body, of speech, or of mind, and of training oneself in virtue, like we saw before, actions that are free from attachment and anger and ignorance. And this kind of dharma is practiced with the intention that I alone will free myself from samsara, including the higher realms. And so, again, we're not talking about rescuing other beings yet. The key feature of the path of the middling being is that they themselves want to break out of samsara as a whole. And to strive towards this goal is considered a practice of the Bodhisattvas in the Tibetan Dondonyer, which is translated here as strive towards that goal. That has a sense of taking great interest or taking up gladly, of happily doing something. And so gladly pursuing this changeless, everlasting liberation is the practice of the Bodhisattvas according to middling beings.
Tarbi gobang dun ba de kibu dingilam resera tarpagi lam dun ba ti kebar dingi le kibu chumo da dingi di chik tarpa korwa dunga korwa da kamsum rikdu ki dunga le tarde tini tarpa thobe gi logic la lam la labgin de la kibu ding sigere kini kibu chumo se di nesong sumgi dunga le tarne la damgon to la da mi go bang gi thobe chit chikbu tarba thobe chit chigi mare di ndo lo chung chare lo chung la tu na lo dingbu di pe ya gi raya tarba thobna ta kamso khorwa la malung bu mare tini dunga nyane yang do nyong bu mare tini ko jirwa me bi dewaji thobe mures 이 개발 딩이래. 로 치중기 개발.
So again, to review the key differences between the paths of the middling beings and of smaller beings, a middling being practices the Dharma for the sake of they themselves breaking free from samsara as a whole, including the so-called happiness of the higher realms. They don't want anything to do with samsara. They want to be free from samsara entirely, whereas a smaller being is only concerned with freeing themselves from the extreme sufferings of the lower realms. And so the difference here lies in the size of their outlook, as it were, compared to a middling being who understands that samsaric happiness is impermanent and strives towards everlasting liberation. The outlook of simply wanting to be free from the lower realms is relatively small in comparison to that. So this is how we get these terms.
충무 딩 첨보세디 꾼롱로샤나 디그레스 꾼롱.
So whether one is a smaller, middling, or great being all depends on one's motivation.
디 최체 마랑수다 삼을 약보 단다 대값수보다 디 숨겨 마랑수 고래 기부 마랑수다 로바 단다 마랑수 기부 팔바지나 기부 팔바다 마랑수나 냠레지게 살바지나 가나 장주 셈바 남기야 되니 코나미게 라글렌 라우드 링기도 라글렌지기도 기부 마랑수다 루이스 기부 팔바지니 숭데 담보 마랑수 크로와딜라 내소숨라 갸지갸지구 지나기고 가서 내소숨라 도마 디코 24 hours 도마 유두자니 수두고 라텔레 대와 데리제민도 테니 딜레 타르도 로지게 테니 딜레 기안 라다미 딜레 라다미 가쟁기 타게 딜레 가르게 키베여레 다 기부디 라다미 또 라다미 톱사도 마랑수 때네 나중에가 밀르르부지 톱산에 다니 미다베라시 바지 하고네다 코로 단도체 딜라 아주 톱이어는데 톱나야 체 데지구지 라다미 고방 톱에 지구지도 아주 밀르르부지 톱지 토라다나 추빈도 체 데지구게 추치나다 아주 톱 추빈도 가 세치마디 유르부르도 스파 세치마디 다 세치마야 다 양도 매기 라다미 고방지 톱나 양제 꼬라 잡는라 미 톱에 당자 톱도 단다야 미 동아 용데레 양제만 미지 톱이오나 동아랑신 용그레 다디 초민도 세네데 냠용지 사 스랑기 냠용스나 셈발라지 딩 라글렌세 고데 삼로 땅술라 따네데 오 다디 라다 미기 데와디 예 지게 타르두기 데와디 마레두 네가기 데와레두 디 양제 계속나 초민도다 톨라르두 델레다 디 코르와 델레 파타르 고사레 삼바지 때디 인도잔 로디기 코라림바 야르게 두고도 야 야르게 체로 되는 코르와레 파 타르두기 로게 코르와레기 타르두기 로데 케차니 오다 코르와레 마란지 부게 타르나다 디기민두 아지 나지부게 동안 용데 나란지부게 타르바 톱잖아 디직 셀피시로 자기도 다 나랑 동안 나신 그디 감성 코로바 딜라에 나랑 파마레 빙갸레 족보 종모레 장마야데 나나신 동안 용되기도 다 대조 탐제야지 나란지부 만들어지미 콘솔란지 펜토사레 스미데니 양지 랑라 냠용 사네 동아데 냠용지 사제 냠용 하고지 되네 하고네야 되니 시행기 동아데야 랑낭신 동아지 용거도 되니 지금 랑게 초르니 하게 동아 랑게 초르지 땅아 시행라야 펜토고사레 삼바지 레그리 야게 드로데라 콤페 드로도 로데 고노데 야게 드로도 되니 다 담마다다 기부 첨부게 남레 그레스
So our text is called refers to the practices of the Bodhisattvas, Laklen in Tibetan. And these are called the practices of Bodhisattvas because they're meant to be practical. We're meant to be able to apply them in real life. And so they're presented gradually in ways that we can actually work with. So first, the path of smaller beings is presented for ordinary people like us, total beginners to the path. First, that first seed is planted in the form of the path of the smaller beings. And so we're meant to reflect on the fact that in the lower realms, beings just suffer excruciating pain 24/7, and there's just no relief, and I don't want any part of that. And so this is a good motivation to develop. And it's a motivation that is accessible to ordinary people. And so then that motivation is gradually expanded upon, gradually improved, because then we begin to reflect on the fact that even the happiness in the higher realms is impermanent, is transitory, and we have currently attained a precious human life. Though its nature is impure, it provides us with an incredible opportunity, but compared to the length of this precious human life, the length of our successive future lives to come is much, much longer. And even if we manage to free ourselves from the extreme suffering of the lower realms, and attain, as we have now, the relative happiness of the higher realms, eventually, as we're born again and again and again, if we are born again and again and again and again, we're eventually going to cycle all the way back around to the lower realms and never experience any kind of lasting happiness during that process. And so this then inspires us to want to be free from samsara as a whole, and that's the path of middling beings, isn't it? So we've now taken that motivation of the smaller beings and expanded it, improved upon it, into the path of middling beings, and then we improve further to become a greater being. The motivation of a greater being observes that, well, if just I break out of samsara, if I achieve liberation from samsara all by myself, that's kind of selfish. No, because just like me, my mother and my father and my friends and my relatives, they all suffer, and they experience happiness and suffering just like I do. And so if I were to just break out of samsara and have nothing to do with it, abandoning all of these other beings that suffer in the same way as I do, that would be a selfish thing. And so then our motivation expands into the motivation of a greater being, which seeks to rescue all beings from samsara. And so we start small in the text, practicing what we're capable of as ordinary people, and then we gradually expand our motivation into that of a greater being who seeks to liberate everyone from samsara.
Tene tiringa de kibu chimbo gilam de la shashana tene jema kibu chimbo gilam de ni shugi is ba tiring kibu chungo da drink charsons.
Okay, so today maybe we'll leave it there. We've covered the paths of the smaller and middling beings, and tomorrow we'll go in depth into the path of a greater being. Are there any questions? Tiwe Yunamina Kantis Tagore. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to tell if there are questions or not. Chat nang lola tiwa lekire tiwa yuna.
That's all. That's oh, Piju Tiwa is a mare. In the last one, drink the some shaggies, right?
Okay, so it seems like maybe there's no questions, so we'll leave it there for today.
The that drops on the shabby Kewa can number Nyembi Kewa. The Chuji Latini, don't they? Migmar chickens, the time to which
So the little bit of merit that Tokula has generated by giving this rough presentation of the text, and the merit that we've generated by listening intently to the Dharma for an hour, we're now going to dedicate to all sentient beings.
So now the Jessic body, Tommy, Donna, Keganaji, Malak, two boys, Sibi, Solen, Drova, Drova, Chanchu, Centurion, Boji, Maji, Panaji, Kebanyamba, Mebaya, one name, one Zebel of Darjin by it and by you in the bed,